Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Welcome to The Dose. My name is Dr. Joelle Brevel, and since our last season, I've started my medical residency. Every day in the hospital reminds me not only why I went into medicine, but also how much our healthcare system still needs to grow. This season's conversations come at a pivotal time when trust in science is under attack. From leaders spreading misinformation about medications and vaccines, to disinformation flooding our social media feeds, the need for truth has never been more urgent. That's why The Dose exists. Fresh ideas, new perspectives, and compelling conversations about where healthcare is headed. This season, you'll hear from Dr. Francis Collins, longtime NIH director, Dr. Fatima Cody-Stanford on obesity medicine, Dr. Kevin Simon on mental health, Dr. Mai Pham on healthcare payment systems and intellectual developmental disabilities, Omari Jimerson on community health, and cultural leader Elaine Walteroth on maternal health. Change begins when truth is spoken aloud, and together we can reimagine the future of healthcare. Join me for new episodes starting on October 10th. This is The Dose.
Find The Dose from the Commonwealth Fund at thedose.show or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, science and home remedies. For nearly 50 years, Joe and Terry Graedon have run The People's Pharmacy, a newspaper column, radio show, books, and podcast, which examine the evidence, or lack thereof, around self-treatment for minor health issues. In today's episode, the Graedons talk to us about the intersections of science and home remedies, how trust in science can actually support self-care, and some recommendations for cures that actually work. Let's listen. Terry and Joe Graedon, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. Would you start out by giving us a little introduction to each of you? Let's start with you, Terry.
Okay, well, I am a medical anthropologist. I dragged Joe off to Oaxaca, Mexico many, many years ago so that I could do my field work in nutrition and community health.
I'm a pharmacologist, not a pharmacist. Couldn't fill a prescription if my life depended upon it. Pharmacology is how drugs work, and we're responsible for training medical and pharmacy students and dental and nursing students on how to use drugs wisely.
And would you tell us about the People's Pharmacy?
Certainly. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, it started as a book, The People's Pharmacy, in 1976, and was surprisingly successful. I think our publisher was amazed, and so were we, that it became a #1 bestseller. And that led to a syndicated newspaper column and eventually a radio show and a website and a podcast. And we've been writing a long time.
Tell us about what you're doing now.
We're still doing all that stuff. We're doing a radio show, a newspaper column, an email newsletter, and of course, the website.
And so tell us, with all of these products that you're producing, what is it that you're talking about?
Well, I think we started dealing with pharmaceuticals because, after all, pharmacology is all about drugs. But Terry, by being a medical anthropologist and by studying what people do, for their own health, we kind of moved into a lot of other areas.
Well, and in particular, as we were doing the radio show in the middle of the 1990s, we started getting a lot of questions about herbs because once Congress passed the Déchets Act in 1994, all of a sudden, there were herbs being sold everywhere. That wasn't the case before.
And, in that first book, in the People's Pharmacy, there was a chapter about home remedies because doctors actually liked home remedies, and they would write about them in places like the New England Journal of Medicine, for example. And so there was a chapter. It wasn't the main chapter, but people were really interested in that. And so since then, we have expanded not just issues around pharmaceuticals, but also home remedies, herbs, and
natural
healing
products. Yeah.
But we always look for the science because that was sort of how we got started. We love randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. And surprisingly, there's a lot of science supporting a number of herbs and home remedies.
So give us an example.
Well, what's the first one you'd like to talk about?
I think the first example should be the very first home remedy that you put in the People's Pharmacy, which was a remedy for persistent hiccups. Now, ordinary hiccups, you don't have to treat them because, they're going to last for 5 or 10 minutes and then they'll go away. A lot of people do treat them anyway with home remedies because 10 minutes is a long time to be hiccuping. But persistent hiccups can be a problem.
So I discovered an article, as I said, in the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Engelman, I think was his name, and he and his colleague had patients who had persistent hiccups that lasted more than a few hours, in some cases a couple of days. And they tested a home remedy, granulated white sugar, a teaspoonful. And they hypothesized that it was stimulating the phrenic nerve, the roof of the palate, and that might somehow be interrupting the hiccup reflex. Now we've kind of come along to the idea that it probably is working through something called trip channels.
Trip channels are so fascinating, and doctors did not know about them. Many doctors still don't. But doctors and biologists actually were studying them in fruit flies around the turn of the 21st century, and we didn't know about them in human medicine until a good bit after that.
That TRP stands for Transient Receptor Potential Channels, TRP.
So they're ion channels on nerves that open up to let an ion like calcium or potassium through, and then they close after it's gone through, and you can't see them anymore. You can't detect them, but they're there. They're there on lots and lots of nerves in important parts of the body, like the skin, like the inside of the mouth, the top of the throat.
And what they were speculating was that by stimulating those nerves, you could interrupt that hiccup reflex.
Because presumably hiccups happen when a nerve connecting to the diaphragm gets a little wonky and starts firing inappropriately.
And by interrupting that reflex, you can stop hiccups. And they did. In about 20 patients, 19 got their hiccups eliminated rather quickly. And we've subsequently collected a lot of hiccup remedies from vinegar, olives, which have vinegar.
Yes, pickles. A quarter slice of lemon with Angostura bitters on it is one of the bartender's favorites, and it's working through the same principles, which is that it's activating the TRP channels, and the TRP channels are stimulating the nerve to overcome that inappropriate nerve activation of the diaphragm.
Extending this to leg cramps, it's working on much the same principle. We had the good fortune to interview Dr. Bruce Bean, who is a Harvard neurobiologist, and he and his colleague,
Dr. Rod McKinnon,
they were in ocean kayaks off the coast of Cape Cod, and they'd been out pretty far, and they developed terrible arm cramps from paddling in very rough seas.
Which is a problem if you're trying to get back to land and you're in an ocean kayak in the ocean.
And so they spent the next 10 years trying to figure out, what causes those kind of muscle cramps? Because up until then, most people said, it's an electrolyte balance problem. They didn't get enough of something. Well, in point of fact, because they are neuroscientists, they took plenty of water and plenty of electrolytes, probably something like Gatorade, didn't help them. So they set out to figure out why.
And Dr. Bean is the first one who really explained how the TRP channels work in this muscle cramp home remedy.
They did some studies where they actually stimulated muscle contractions and then found out how to interrupt them. And what they found was that a lot of the home remedies that, for example, football coaches have been using for decades, like pickle juice, out on a hot July day when their recruits are practicing hard and developing cramps, they could interrupt those muscle cramps with pickle juice. And then Dr. Bean and Dr. McKinnon came up with something else.
They developed a proprietary product. It has hot pepper essence, capsaicin in it, along with a few other flavors, ginger, which also is kind of hot, and cinnamon, I believe. It's designed to stimulate the trip channels, and it works pretty well.
And it worked fast. Electrolyte imbalance takes a long time to reestablish, but this is like, boom, really quick. And so it has to be through some kind of a nerve stimulation. And that's just another example of like a home remedy that has a mechanism of action.
This is an excellent example of, home remedy for what I'm going to call kind of a low stakes problem. Hiccups, muscle cramps. If you're not out on the sea kayaking trying to get back in, these are low stakes problems.
Yes.
Tell us about a home remedy that you've looked at, whether it worked or not, for maybe a higher stakes problem.
It all depends on how you define higher stakes, but I would define bleeding as a pretty serious problem. Now, really bad cut deserves emergency medicine treatment. A minor cut in the kitchen, for example, a little black pepper can stop that very quickly, like within seconds. But we've heard from people who, for example, someone who was, I think, in
Mongolia. It was a couple, an older couple, traveling in Mongolia, very remote area, and the husband was on warfarin, which prevents blood from clotting. So he bumped into a piece of furniture in the place that they were staying, and it started to bleed.
And bleed and bleed, and it was becoming a life-threatening situation. And then they remembered the black pepper.
They did have ground black pepper. It's important that it be ground because you're not going to be able to get enough by, turning the grinder. So they remembered that ground black pepper applied to a cut might stop bleeding. And in fact, that's exactly what it did for him.
And they said it saved his life. Now,
it probably didn't save his life, but I imagine it made a big difference.
Right. So, again, for something that's really serious, we're always going to recommend emergency medicine treatment if it's available.
For a burn, for example.
Right. But sometimes you're in a situation where you can't access an emergency physician. But the bottom line was that in their case, that black pepper did work and they were grateful. In other cases, we've heard of people who have burned themselves very badly and were in isolated areas and they just couldn't get to an emergency department. And many people have told us that yellow mustard can be helpful, or
soy sauce, which we actually don't know why soy sauce works, but it does.
On a burn.
Yes, it takes away the pain pretty quickly.
So far, what you've talked about are home remedies that people have tried, and over time, you've seen a building body of evidence that these things work. What do you look for to say definitively that something works?
Well, we have a motto: might help, won't hurt, and doesn't cost very much. And so if it fits those three categories, that's going to be worth considering. And then it's the number of people. So if we write about soy sauce, for example, in our newspaper column, and nobody responds, we're never going to write about or talk about it again. But if all of a sudden people start telling us, oh yeah, I tried that, it worked, and somebody else says, oh, that was phenomenal, and we begin collecting enough quote unquote anecdotes that say, yeah, that soy sauce thing is amazing, we start to pay attention. Here's the thing. If the home remedy works and you can see it working or feel it working, you may not need a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. For example, if you cut your finger in the kitchen and it's bleeding and you put some fine ground black pepper on it and it stops bleeding.
I did that the other day. It worked.
You don't need much more than that.
Well, let me ask you this. We are in a time where trust in health institutions is eroding. We are at a time where there is mistrust of things like big pharma, where access to these things, even if you do trust them, might not be available. And so there is a movement to kind of do more of these home remedies and to rely more on them. But where do you come down on the balance between, you're saying like if it doesn't hurt and it might help and it's cost effective, go for it. What crosses that line for you?
Well, definitely something that might hurt. We don't want people using. And there are a number of suggested home remedies that fall into that category. For example, we'll every so often hear from somebody who says, well, if your child has lice, you should use kerosene on their scalp. No, you should not use kerosene on their scalp. And so far, we are also talking mostly about, as you put it, low stakes situations. That's where I think self-care is most appropriate. If you have a cut and it's gushing blood, don't mess around with the black pepper. Just get straight to the emergency department where they can take care of you. That's what makes sense.
I think common sense. I mean, that's the critical component in self-care. If something is serious, I mean, if you start to not be able to speak well and things are kind of blurry and you're dizzy, you might be having a stroke. There's no home remedy for that. You
call the ambulance.
Yeah, go immediately to the emergency department or have the ambulance take you.
And what about things like, for example, during the COVID pandemic, there was all of these remedies and even off-label uses of other medications. What was the messaging then?
Oh, boy.
Well, COVID was a serious condition.
It was very serious.
It was potentially fatal. And, when it comes to a very serious condition, we want randomized controlled trials. And how you conduct those trials is rather important because you really need to have an open mind. I happen to think ivermectin is one of the greatest drug developments of all time. It cured millions of people from river blindness, onchocerciasis. Great drug. If you're going to want to test it against something like COVID, you better have a really, really good clinical trial to demonstrate its effectiveness and be able to prove once and for all it either does or does not work. And even to this day, I think some of the clinical trials were not done as well as they could have been. So for me, I'm still not sure if ivermectin has any benefit or not. But the bottom line is that when you have a serious condition, you absolutely have to do clinical trials, especially if somebody's making money. I mean, that's the other thing. If you're going to use sugar for hiccups, nobody's making money on that one. But if you're going to advertise on television, you have a surefire cure for fill in the blank, you darn well better have evidence to prove that it works.
All right, last question for you. What's one thing that the two of you are firm believers of, even if the science doesn't stand up?
So what is it?
Soap under the bottom sheet for leg cramps.
As a preventative.
Right. So, we've heard about this for decades.
Yes.
Putting a bar of soap under the bottom sheet.
We don't have any evidence that it works, but we use it ourselves, and we've heard from a lot of people who find it helpful. Now, if the soap happens to fall out of bed, it doesn't work anymore. So,
So for us, that's a low risk, high benefit because, I played a lot of tennis yesterday and I was thinking, oh boy, I'm going to have leg cramps tonight. Nope. The soap was
there. It worked.
Seemed to be working.
Just a bar of soap under the sheet?
A bar of soap under the bottom sheet, in between the sheet and the mattress cover.
That's okay. We'll take it. Joe and Terry Graedon, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Lindsay.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.